Hello, and welcome to Higher Rock Education. What determines how much an economy produces? It's the resources, the people, capital, natural resources, entrepreneurial talent. In other words, the factors of production. The factors of production determine how much an economy is capable of producing. The aggregate supply is a total supply of goods and services that producers are willing to supply or produce at a given price level. This implies that the price level affects aggregate production. After all, in microeconomics, we learned that suppliers increase production when the price of their good or services increase. Now hold on. Let's go back. The price level is the general level of prices in an economy, usually measured by the Consumer Price Index. The price level rises when we have inflation. The price level is in the definition of aggregate supply, but it isn't one of the factors of production. Didn't we say that production potential depends on the factors of production? Well, in the long run, if we assume that the price of all inputs and the price of the final good increase 50%, then the company would not alter production. No. The relative prices are the same, so production would be unaffected by the increase in the price level. This is the long-run aggregate supply curve. It's shown on the graph. The long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical because it is unaffected by the price level. Like the aggregate demand graph, the price level is on the vertical axis and real gross domestic product is on the horizontal axis. The long-run aggregate supply curve intersects the horizontal axis where the economy would be operating at full employment. In other words, the factors of production would be efficiently used. But what about the short run? Does a change in the price level affect the short-run aggregate supply? Economists believe that the short-run aggregate supply curves upward. Why? After all, every input's price is increasing or decreasing the same percentage. Well, this is true, but they don't change at the same rate. It may take a month for energy prices to increase, but labor costs may not increase for years if worker compensation is tied to contracts. Some input prices are what we call sticky. They change slowly. The sticky wage theory explains the upward slope of the aggregate supply curve. The theory is that wages are sticky, meaning they're slower to respond to an increase or decrease in the price level. Businesses take advantage of this to maximize profits. Now, let's assume for a minute that the price level increases 10% and you own a manufacturing plant that makes furniture. Your workers are members of a union and have long-term contracts. Prices increase. You love it because you're able to increase the price of your furniture. Your profits would increase because you don't have to pay your workers more. During these periods, it would make sense to increase production when the price level increases. But eventually, production will return to the long-run aggregate supply when your union negotiates a new wage. Let's take a look at some of the other characteristics of the short-run aggregate supply curve. First, it's not very steep at production levels much lower than the long-term aggregate supply curve. This is represented by point A on the graph. Remember, the long-run aggregate supply curve intersects the horizontal axis where the real gross domestic product equals the full employment production level. In other words, production is the most efficient on the long-run aggregate supply curve. To the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve, point A, there is unemployment and factories have excess capacity. There is not much pressure for companies to increase their prices. However, note the curve becomes very steep as it approaches the long-run aggregate supply curve, such as point B on our graph. As full employment is approached, businesses must bid for workers. Plants approach their capacity, and these businesses are not in a position to increase production dramatically in response to an increase in the price level. Finally, notice that the short-run aggregate supply curve intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve. How is this possible? After all, the long-run aggregate supply curve represents the full employment level of production. That's right. But full employment assumes that workers don't work overtime. It also includes some unemployment. After all, at any given moment, there are some workers who aren't changing jobs. On a short-term basis, companies can stretch beyond the long-run aggregate supply by requiring workers to work overtime and stretching their plants to the max. Sustained economic growth requires a rightward shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. What could happen to cause this shift? Remember, the long-run aggregate supply curve is independent on the factors of production. So any change in the factors of production will affect the long-run aggregate supply curves. Examples might include a relaxation of immigration policy would increase the labor pool and shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. A technological advance that is applicable to most industries would also shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right because it increases productivity. A new government policy to foster entrepreneurial ventures would also push the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right by providing incentives to develop new businesses. A discovery of a field of crude oil would increase the long-run aggregate supply curve by lowering resource costs. Whenever there's a long-run shift, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts as well. However, there can be a short-run shift that is not reflected in the long-run shift. For example, assume a natural disaster triggers a temporary but sharp increase in the price of a natural resource, commonly used by manufacturers. Manufacturing's costs just increase dramatically, so the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. Eventually, fortunately, prices would return to normal and the short-run curve would shift back. The next step in understanding the aggregate demand and supply model is to combine the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. This will help us understand the relationship between economic growth, employment, and inflation. Thanks for watching. To learn more about this lesson and other important economic concepts, please visit our website at higherrockeducation.com. Thank you.